All right, so here we are in Maya 2014, and I've got a new blank scene going here. And in this section of the lecture, we're going to go over the interface. So I'm going to talk a lot about different ways to navigate the interface, the different sections or how the interface is divided into different areas, as well as just some basic ideas on how to get around. So this is just going to be kind of like an overview tour. As you can see when you start up Maya, I have a grid here, and I'm looking at my virtual set. So I think of Maya as being kind of like an entire movie studio. It's just this huge place where you can create any number of things, everything from models to dynamics to rendered animations and so on and so forth. So there's a lot you can do just within the Maya environment. In fact, Maya is so big that I've been using it since version 1 back in 1998, and I can tell you I have not mastered every aspect of Maya yet. Very few, if anybody, actually does become a master of everything in Maya. That's why a lot of people will tend to specialize and become, make an entire career out of just one aspect of Maya. So it could be rendering and lighting, or it could be animation or rigging or so on and so forth. And then other people like to be generalists. I myself am a generalist, and it has the advantage of making it easier to get jobs because there's more things that you can do. But every generalist tends to know most aspects of Maya pretty well, and maybe a few aspects of Maya very well. And it takes a little bit longer to become a generalist than to specialized. But in any case, regardless of how you decide to use Maya or how you end up using Maya in the future, this lecture is targeted towards everyone. So what I'm going to be showing you is relevant to everything you're going to do. So let's get started with just some basic navigation. If you want to tumble the view in Maya, you can hold the Control or Alt key and left mouse button drag. If you want to pan the view, you can hold the Alt or Control key and middle mouse button drag. And if you want to zoom in or out, you can hold the Alt or Control key and right mouse button drag, and that'll allow you to zoom. If there's an object in the scene, I'll create like a little sphere here. And I'm like way over here. If I want to focus on that object, I just need to select it and then press the F key, and we'll zoom in right there. So that's very handy, and you'll see me do that quite a bit. What we're looking through here is the perspective view, but there are also other views that you can take a look at in Maya. I'm going to go over here to the toolbar here and click on this little icon right here, which will bring up one of the layout presets. In this preset, we see essentially a top view. So these are orthographic views in that they don't have a perspective distortion. So I have a top view, I have front view, and I have a side view. And you can see I can navigate these guys independently. And then I have my perspective view up here. So these are actually separate cameras in Maya. A top camera, a front camera, and a side camera, and also a perspective camera. If I want to quickly bounce between one window to the other, I could just hover over a window, hit the space bar, and that will just sort of expand that. Hit the space bar again to go back here to the previous layout, and I can switch between these guys just by doing that. So that's kind of helpful. And also we have, as I mentioned earlier, a bunch of layout presets here. So if you want to go back to just that single perspective view, we can click right here. Then we have our 4 view. We also have perspective plus the outliner editor, which gives us kind of an overview of the entire scene and all the nodes in the scene. We also have the perspective view here at the top and the graph editor down here, where we're going to do our editing our keyframes and that kind of thing. Then we also have another preset up here. I click on them, sometimes they take a few seconds to load. We have the perspective view, the hyper shade, and we even have what's known as the node editor down here, which is a new editor that was introduced in Maya 2013. But it's been updated in 2014, and there's a lot of cool features I'll be showing you about this in this chapter, as well as others. Okay, so that's another preset. Then we can go over here. We have perspective view, graph editor. This time we have the hypergraph, which is kind of the older version of the node editor. And then you can even go in and customize your own layout if you'd like to. The one that you'll see me use a lot is the perspective and outliner view, because I like to see everything that's going on in the scene, and I also like to see my perspective view. In the view panels, we have our own little menu bars. As you can see, there's an awful lot of menus and menu bars and icons in Maya. A lot of them kind of repeat similar functions, so don't become too overwhelmed. And I'll show you different ways to get to each function. But let's start with just looking at the menu here in the view panel. So we have a bunch of options for viewing, including selecting the camera that we're currently looking through. Like I said before, if we wanted to frame the selection, we can go down here and do frame selection. So a lot of these are just repeated functions. And then we also have a way to get our camera settings and some specific camera tools, setting up an image plane, which we'll talk about a little bit later, as well as a bunch of other functions. In the shading menu, we have different ways to look at the way the model is depicted in the perspective view. We can do flat shading. I'm going to deselect this so we can see what flat shading looks like. Bounding box, we just want to see the bounding box. Points, we just want to see a point cloud. There are several hotkeys for switching between these different shading modes, and I tend to use these a little bit more than the menu. 4, we have wireframe. 5, we have shaded, flat shaded. 6, we actually have textured. I don't have any textures on the model just yet, so it's going to look kind of the same as the shaded view. And then 7, we actually have lighted view, which we can actually see the effect of light as we add lights in the scene. So if I create something like a spotlight here, you can see how it's sort of affecting the object in the scene. So that's the 7 key. I usually use 5 or 6 the most often, depends on what I'm trying to do. If I'm just doing some basic modeling, I'll hit 5 to go in flat shaded view, and that's nice and fast. We have some lighting options, including showing the lights, showing shadows, specifying lights. We'll talk about this a little bit later on. We can show different items with the show menu. I'll use this fairly often, whereas let's say we have several different types of objects. So let's say I have a NURB sphere and a polygon sphere, and let's see, I'll create a curve here, and other types of objects. If I use the show menu, what I can do is I'm going to turn all of these off by hitting none, and then I can say I just want to see the NURB surfaces, or maybe I just want to see the NURBS curves. Maybe I want to see polygons, but not the curves. This is a very handy menu, especially when you're doing things like animating and you're trying to clear clutter out of the way when you're trying to work in the scene. The show menu can be very helpful. If we want to turn everything back on, we can hit all. Now we can see every type of object. Renderer here is different types of renderers. So we have a default quality rendering, which is a very simplified shading of the scene, but also has the advantage of fast interaction. Then we have high quality rendering. So I will put on a slightly fancier shader here just so we can sort of take advantage of that. And don't worry about every single step that I'm doing just yet. We'll be talking more about these as we go forward. You can see if I throw a texture on here, the difference between default quality rendering and high quality rendering, and now the special viewport 2.0, which is introduced in the past few versions of Maya, but which has also been upgraded in 2014. And it comes closer to something that could almost be like a real-time renderer. Okay, so that's sort of the renderers. I'm going to go to default quality rendering. And then we have panels. We have different ways to switch from the cameras. So I can go to, let's say, side view or the front view, switch back to the perspective view. If I wanted a duplicate or a second perspective view, I can go in here and go panels, perspective, new, and now I have a second perspective view. So I have this one, which is called Pers 1, and I also have the other perspective. And if I switch to, say, the 4 view, I could do like one perspective in this one, in this view, and another perspective camera in this view. And that could be helpful, especially when you're animating separate cameras for separate shots and that kind of thing. And of course, as you notice, I also have different types of displays and different cameras. I could even have something like, viewport 2.0 in this camera and default quality rendering in this camera. So that could be very helpful. Switch back to perspective outliner. You can see in the outliner that as I create things like these curves, the sphere, polygon sphere, another perspective camera, that new nodes are showing up here, and I can select them by clicking here. We'll talk more about the outliner coming up, but as I'm working in Maya, you can sort of see what's going on by checking out the outliner, see what nodes have been added to the scene. The outliner is also useful for taking a look at hierarchies. So for instance, if I parent one object to another by middle mouse button dragging the object on top of it, this object becomes the parent. So that means when I move or rotate this object, the other object moves with it because it is a child of this node. So this is very helpful when taking a look at complex hierarchies such as joint chains and that kind of stuff. All the nodes are listed out here in the outliner. So here's an example of a scene that's a little bit more complex than a couple of spheres. I got a little bug character here, and it's all rigged and ready for animation and all kinds of fun. And let's take a look in the outliner. You can see we have all the nodes here in the scene, and I have hierarchies here. So if I click on this little plus sign, it expands the hierarchy, and you can see here's all the geometry that makes up the bug. And I have them completely, and I have all of these pieces of geometry under a single group. If we take a look at, say, the controls in here, you're going to see that I actually have hierarchies of controls. That's these curves here that I use to actually manipulate the object. If I want to see expand an entire hierarchy all at once, I can shift-click on the plus sign. And for instance, now you can see all the joints in the scene. And you can see that the hierarchy is much more complex. If I go to the show menu and hit joints, you can see here are my joints. If I select an object here in the outliner, you can see it's highlighted in green out here. So the outliner is a great way to sort of get a quick view of everything in the scene, and also how the relationship of one object to another in the scene. It's a personal preference. Some people like to use the outliner a lot. I use it a lot. I know other Maya artists who don't use it as much. There's, as we're going to see in the rest of this chapter, there's a lot of different ways to get at the same information in Maya, whether it's using the outliner or something like the hypergraph. What we're looking at is all the different data types within Maya that make up our Maya scene. And the nice thing about Maya, one of the more powerful things about it, is there's so many different ways to approach manipulating this data that you're not stuck with just one. You can actually find a system that works with your own style of working. So that's the outliner. If we take a look here next to the outliner, we have the toolbar, and this is where we actually select the various tools to manipulate the object in the Maya scene. So we have a basic select tool, so I can select things like this curve up here, this curve controller, or this joint, or the surface, just by clicking on it. So all the selection tool does is allow you to pick one thing or the other. We also have a lasso selection, so if I want to select a number of things. It's usually most helpful when you're working with things like polygon faces. So I'm going to create a new scene here real quick. And you don't have to worry about every single thing that I'm doing right here. I just want to sort of show you the advantage of the lasso tool. So if I have something like a sphere here, and I'm going to hit the 5 key to switch to shaded and vertex, and if I select the lasso selection, I could do things like select just those vertices or just these vertices or so on. There's also a paint selection tool that allows you to paint your selection. So I'm going to select this guy and do say something like face, right click over and choose face, and use the paint selection. If I want to change the width of the paintbrush here, I just hold the B key and drag with the left mouse button. And you can see now I can do things like select faces with a paint selection. And that could be really useful, especially if you're trying to select something very specific. So down here we also have the move tool, which allows us to move objects. If I drag in the center of the move tool, I can sort of move it perpendicular to the camera view. And then I also have these arrows, which I can click and drag if I want to restrict the movement to just one axis. I have the rotate tool, same thing. If I drag on the center of it, then I can sort of do a free rotation. But I also have these circles here that allow me to rotate along a specific axis. And then you have this blue circle that allows us to rotate completely perpendicular to the screen. So that's kind of helpful. The way that these, you'll notice these controllers, they're color-coded. So you'll see that one of the circles is green, one is red, and the other is blue. Similarly, if I select the Move tool, I have green, red, and blue. Well, remember, RGB, X, Y, Z. So red is for X, G is for Y, and blue is for Z. So RGB, X, Y, Z. Same with the circle. You know that this is the X-axis because it's red, this is the Y-axis because it's green, this is the Z-axis because it's blue. Then we also have a scale tool. Similar, I can drag on the center cube here, the scale tool, and drag back and forth to scale up and down, or if I want to scale on a specific axis. So that is the tool menu, and then right here is an icon for the last tool I used to create. The last tool I actually selected for the menu. When I said create CV curve tool way back when, it remembers that as the last tool that I selected. So I can click on this and then draw another curve. Okay, so that's this menu over here, and then we also have this little icon right here. If we click this, this will actually bring us up to the Autodesk website, which is kind of cool. Just if you need to get there in a hurry. So take a look at the toolbox and then the panel up here at the top. Let's go above this, and you'll see right here we have these shelves. So these are just different ways to access the tools. Again, it's just another way to get to the same information. So if you saw me before when I created a sphere, I went to the Create menu and chose Polygon, Sphere, or any of these primitives right here. Well, the shelves, and for instance, if I go to the Polygon shelf, I have another way to create things like a polygon, sphere, or a cube, or so on, just by clicking on these little icons. You can see it creates one right here at the center of the screen. A pyramid and so on, and then it has a bunch of other different functions. Like if I select a vertex here, I can click on this, and it will actually bevel that one vertex or chamfer it or whatever. So it's just a bunch of extra functions. We have all sorts of shells. We have shells for different types of geometry, curves, NURB surfaces, polygons. We have a general shelf, deformation, animation, so on and so forth. So these are just different icons for accessing commonly used tools. What's interesting is I have just the habit of the way that I work. I use a couple of these shelves like constantly, but I don't use all of them. But that's just the way that I've sort of learned to work over the past few years, mostly out of habit. But the cool thing is that there's also a custom shelf right here, which you can see I have a couple buttons on here that you probably don't have, because these are actually custom Mel scripts that I created and turned into buttons because they're something that I use fairly often. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to create a shelf button later on, but it's very handy to have this nice custom shelf where I can just create all the shelf buttons that I need. Above the shelves, we have the status bar, which has more buttons. One of the most important ones is this little drop-down menu over here, which allows us to access the different modes within Maya. So Maya has a lot of menus, so many menus that they can't fit them all in one menu or one toolbar. So what they've done is they've created this drop-down menu that allows us to switch between different menu sets. In the yellow on my computer, and I'm currently using a Mac, but you'll see this on the toolbar and PC as well, I have a bunch of different menus here. So if, right now this drop-down menu says rendering. So if I switch to something like polygons, you'll see these menus don't change, but these do. So I have a bunch of custom menus that are appropriate for polygon modeling and not so much for rendering. If I switch to animation, you'll see these guys change again, and dynamics and so on and so forth. So these are menu sets. So they allow you to just choose between different menu sets. And I bounce between these guys all the time in Maya as I'm doing different things. And then we have some buttons for doing things like creating a new scene, We'll talk more about these selection masks in a later chapter, but that's what these allow you to sort of customize what gets selected or how it gets selected in a scene. And then we have some snapping tools, which we're going to talk a lot about. And then different sort of functions in terms of like graphing the inputs of the selection, construction history, different renderers, and so on. So really just a bunch of icons for useful features. Most of these we'll be talking about in more detail within this lecture. And then over in this section of the interface, we have this large area, which is labeled as an attribute editor. And this part of the interface will switch between several different types of panels. So right now I have it set to the attribute editor. So if I right-click over the sphere and choose Select to select it, you can see I have these tabs. And these are tabs that allow us to access different attributes of the nodes that are connected to this sphere node. So that sounds like a mouthful. Don't worry about it. We'll be talking about it in more detail later on. But this is what's known as the attribute editor. What I really want to show you here is there are different ways to have different things pop up in this area. So currently I have it to the attribute editor, which is what I get when I click this button. So if I click this, I can toggle between the attribute editor. Then I also have, if I click on this again, I have the channel box, which shows us the different attribute channels of this selected object. We'll be talking about this in a lot of detail as well. If we want to switch back to the attribute editor, you can click that. If I click on this little wrench button right here, this panel pops open over here, which is the tool settings. And these are the options for the current tool. So for instance, if I select the move tool, I have a whole bunch of options for how I can move this surface, whether it's on its own local space or in world space, or if I want to do things like turn on soft selection, so that when I select things like vertices, I have like, fall off within a certain range. So more options for tools. That's what this little icon does here. Talk more about those later. And then I also have this, which I can click. It just sort of turns those on. It turns on the channel box. It allows us to switch between these sort of tabs here. You'll notice that I have these different tabs that will also allow me to switch between the channel box and the attribute editor. Now the new exciting thing in Maya 2014 is the modeling toolkit, which we'll talk about as well, but that's what this green highlighted button does. It allows us to go to the new modeling toolkit, which is integrated into Maya. It's really a plugin. It used to be known as Nex, but now it is the modeling toolkit, and it comes as part of Maya. And it has really much more advanced polygon modeling tools than the standard ones in Maya. So it's kind of like expanding the existing tools. It's really exciting because it makes things like retopology or resurfacing high-res meshes much easier and makes the modeling process a lot more enjoyable. So we'll be talking about that later on, but that allows us to get to the modeling toolkit. If I click it again, we'll switch back to the previous editor, which is the attribute editor. So that's sort of this side of the screen. Down here we have the timeline, which shows us where we are if we have something animated in the scene. So you can see I can left mouse button drag. Nothing's animated currently, but if I select this object and hit the S key, puts a keyframe on its translate, rotate, and scale. Move to a later point in the scene, move it over here, scale, rotate, and then hit the S key again. You can see now as I scrub back and forth at the timeline, I have a little very basic animation here. So there's the timeline. We have below this, we have the range slider, which allows us to sort of zoom in or zoom out of the entire range of the animation. And then we have the input line, and down here the status or the script editor. Access to where we can do things like enter Mel scripts or Python scripts and see a running record of what's been going on in the scene. So, yes, I went through that very quickly, but don't worry, we'll be getting into more detail. We also have playback controls, so we could rewind or play backwards in the animation, go to the start of the animation. This kind of sort of typical tape deck controls.